In this module, we will be talking about form, another element of art. More specifically, in this section, we will be talking about form as it relates to the human figure and how it has been represented through the ages. Much the same way as with image-based media, three-dimensional media can have recognizable forms. It can represent familiar figures, natural or otherwise man-made. The earliest representations of the human figure are fertility goddesses. The most famous of these is the Venus of Willendorf. It is a very small statuette made of limestone tinted with red ochre pigment, and it measures about 10.6 by 5.7 by 4.5 centimeters. It is without doubt one of the earliest examples of figurative art, dating back to between 33,000 and 20,000 years ago, making it a product of the Gravettian culture. The Venus of Hohlefels is an even earlier specimen. It was carved out of mammoth ivory, and it is smaller than the Venus of Willendorf, measuring only about 6 by 3.5 by 3 centimeters. It was recently found in the Swabian Jura of southwestern Germany near a bone flute. It dates back to approximately 42,000 years ago, thus locating it in the Aurignacian period. Much the same way as with shape, the human figure has been depicted in various styles throughout the ages. Schematic forms of representation eventually gave place to rigid yet natural depictions in the archaic Greek period. Notice the left leg forward in this 6th century BC choroi. This simple but effective element suggests a modicum of movement. In Greek antiquity, the strict symmetry of the choroi eventually gave way to full-blown naturalism in the rendering of the human form. Here is the statue of a victorious youth, created in the classical period between 200 and 100 BC. Notice the natural posture. Now notice how the center axis is not a straight line, but slightly curved instead. This sculpture is a good example of contrapposto, or counterpoise, which is when a human figure stands on one leg called the engaged leg, so the opposite hip rises. The ensuing curvature creates a natural, lively, and relaxed posture. Praxiteles, Hermes, and Dionysius is another great example of contrapposto. Notice the natural treatment of muscles and drapery, characteristic of Praxiteles' style. The main human figure is leaning against a small tree trunk, one engaged leg, the other freed and bent at the knee. This generates internal movement but also lack of equilibrium. Because weight is distributed unequally on both legs, this unstable sculptural element requires support, a role fulfilled by the tree trunk and drapery. Classical Greece was followed by the boldness of the Hellenistic period. The winged victory of Samothrace represents the goddess Nike, which means victory. Notice the natural and almost heroic treatment of drapery, which conveys the illusion of movement as the wind blows, creating folds. The famous Laocoon and his sons, also from the Hellenistic period, was created in the 1st century BC. And it has been attributed to Rhodesian sculptors Agesander, Polydorus, and Athenodorus. Not unlike the winged victory of Samothrace, it is a big and ambitious sculpture. Nowhere like here can we see the complex and fluid compositions typical of this period. Here we have 3 different human figures that could as well be 3 separate sculptures, but they feel like one. The reason why is the serpent that gives unity to the whole composition. Again, everything feels very real, the muscles, the facial expressions, and the drapery, the proportions, almost even the gestures. Also, can you spot the devices used by the artists to give physical support to this masterpiece? Proportions between elements can change depending on the artist's style as well as tastes of a particular period. The Greek sculptor Polykleitos, for instance, wrote a treatise titled Kanon or Canon, meaning measure or standard, and Lysippus, another Greek sculptor, is credited with having established the 8 heads canon. Not unlike foreshortening in image-based media such as painting and photography, proportions can also be adjusted depending from where viewers see a sculpture. Michelangelo's David, created between 1501 and 1504, was originally intended to be placed high up on the facade of the Cathedral of Florence. Viewers were supposed to see this sculpture from below, meaning that the proportions of the various elements were adjusted accordingly. The Hellenistic and Roman periods gave way to the stiff, elongated human figures of Romanesque and Gothic art. Notice how drapery is depicted in these sculptures from 12th century France. They are so different from the previous sculptures, right? Everything is all too schematic and very unnatural, including the proportions of the human body. There's almost no volume, only line. It is almost bidimensional. Romanesque and Gothic sculpture is schematic in its treatment of drapery and the human figure. But here in the sculptural group, which depicts the Annunciation and Visitation, just a century later, the human figure is natural once again. The figures are round and alive, as is the drapery that covers the bodies underneath. There is also a modicum of movement and even contrapposto. We are fast approaching the Proto-Renaissance, with its renewed interest in the study of classical antiquity. It suddenly becomes important again to depict nature and the human body as realistically as possible. This renewed interest in all things human will develop into the full rebirth of naturalism during the Renaissance. In this Pietà from the turn of the 15th century, we can see two full-body volumetric figures, rendered with anatomical precision as well as fluid and natural drapery. The profound sorrow expressed in this Virgin Mary holding the body of the dead Christ in her lap could be that of any mother in similar circumstances. When Michelangelo Buonarroti creates this Pietà around 1498–99, as well as the monumental David a couple of years later, we are at the footsteps of the High Renaissance period. The anatomic features are lifelike and the skin looks real, even if the figures are somewhat out of proportion, while the folds in the drapery are incredibly intricate. In the subsequent period, the Mannerist period, a new taste will develop with ever more elaborate compositions and exaggerated poses. Giambologna's Abduction of a Sabine Woman, 1579–1583, is a good example of Mannerist sculpture, with its almost too graceful elegant poses. It is also an extraordinary example of the figura serpentinata, or serpentine figure that we saw before in the masterpiece of late Hellenistic Baroque, the Laocoon. The Laocoon was discovered and unearthed in 1506, having a huge impact in the artists working at that time, including Giambologna. This sculpture is composed of three cohesive figures, each facing different sides, which makes not only for a very complex composition, but for a dynamic one at that. There is also no privileged viewpoint. Each side of this sculpture gives you different silhouettes, forms are ever-changing, and time suddenly becomes an important element when contemplating this sculpture. It's not only the incredibly complex compositions that we start seeing in the Mannerist period. In fact, it's the techniques themselves that attain a high degree of sophistication. Cellini's Perseus with Medusa's Head, circa 1554, is a good showcase of the advanced casting techniques typical of this period. Notice specifically how the hair in Perseus's head is depicted with so much detail. The same goes for the serpents in the severed head of Medusa, with blood oozing from her neck. As we get into the Baroque, we start seeing dramatic gestures depicted at the moment of least equilibrium, as well as dramatic drapery with plenty of shadows. In this masterpiece of the Baroque, Bernini depicts an ecstatic Saint Teresa in a state of abandonment, as if she's being touched by God himself. We can almost feel what Saint Teresa is feeling, although there is very little of her that we can see. Her feet, her hands, and her face only. The drapery here makes for everything else, what we can't see but certainly feel. A turmoil of lights and shadows echoing the spiritual and bodily pain as a seraph drives a golden spear through her heart.